So good evening. My name is Sarah Palomo. I am a founding board member of the Ninth Candle, a really amazing organization you are going to hear about in a little bit. I am also a specialist in diversity at Bain & Company. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this roundtable discussion, which we're calling the future of Holocaust education in the United States. So I really want to begin by thanking you for being here, and we're delighted to have participants from across the country. So this is a critical moment for the future of Holocaust education in the United States. This Thursday is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the recent incident in Colleyville, Texas was a disturbing reminder that anti-Semitic myths remain persistent and widely believed. We will ask ourselves difficult questions tonight, and it can be no longer taken for granted that our own sense of urgency about Holocaust education is shared. So in order to secure its future, we need to be ready to articulate the reasons for its importance across communities, across ethnic, religious, and political boundaries. So there will be an opportunity during this discussion tonight to ask any questions you might have towards the end of the discussion. You are able to chat, use the chat box, or feel free to raise your hand when we get to that portion of the event. So I'm going to now invite our speakers to go ahead and introduce themselves and their wonderful organizations that they represent. So we will begin with Brooke, then we will go to Daniel, and then we'll go to Luke. And for those that just joined, welcome. We are just doing introductions. And again, Brooke, please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. My name is Brooke Randel. I'm a writer and a speaker, and I am the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. And through 3GNY, I speak and tell my grandma's stories in classrooms and for other organizations. And 3GNY is an organization that was started by grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to teach grandchildren how to tell their grandparents' stories and present them to classrooms specifically, so we can continue their legacy of remembering the Holocaust.
Thank you. Shalom. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Aschheim. I'm the Deputy Consul General of Israel to the Midwest. We are situated in Chicago, responsible for 9 Midwestern states. And our role is bringing Midwest closer to Israel and Israel closer to the Midwest, whether it's connected to political ties, economic ties, cultural ties, academic ties, people to people, education, and any way we can bring the people, the societies, and the politicians closer together.
And good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Luke Berryman. I am the founder of the Ninth Candle. I wrote a PhD on Nazi Germany. It was about how they had used classical music in their propaganda. And after I'd completed that, I went to work in education. I had about 10 years work in different facets of the educational world. And then in 2020, I founded the Ninth Candle. We are a Chicago-based nonprofit organization whose mission is to end anti-Semitism by sharing knowledge. And we partner with schools all across the US to offer them free educational programs for their students and also professional development programs for their teachers.
Great. Okay. Thank you all for the introductions. We are going to go ahead and make the most of this time together. We're going to jump right into the questions. So Brooke, this one will be for you. So the Holocaust, sorry, Brooke, for you to start off. The Holocaust is just one of a multitude of historical events. And why should we push for students to know more about it? And is there a risk of other subjects or topics being sidelined as a result? And what do students stand to gain from knowing about the Holocaust in particular?
Great. It's a huge question. And in thinking about it, I really don't think there's one answer. There's so many answers why it's important to teach the Holocaust. From a 3G perspective, I think it's really easy for us to feel like this was a long time ago. That was a different place. It couldn't possibly happen. Like, just create distance between the past and the present. but the fact is we wouldn't be here in the present without the past. So building that bridge and helping people understand what happened, how it happened, and the fact that we are connected to the past really helps bring it to life and give it more meaning for students who might not understand the relevance. There's also been a lot of studies done on the impact of hearing testimony, specifically survivor testimony. I know Echoes and Reflections has done surveys on this, and students who have engaged directly with survivor testimony score higher in critical thinking, interpersonal tolerance, social responsibility, a score of measures. So there's also incredible value for students to actually engage with the Holocaust in such an engaged way. And then just my last thought on why it's so important is that the Holocaust was a genocide, and the final stage of genocide is denial, and there are active forces trying to create distance from the truth. So the work we do today to educate future generations actually has a great impact on our view as a whole on injustice and the history of what happened, and making sure it's preserved for future generations.
I mean, I would, thanks, Brooke. I was just furiously taking notes through all of that. There's so many interesting points. And Dr. A, if you're okay with me jumping in to just offer some comments. I love the idea about 3GNY providing a bridge to the past. I think that's so important. And, you know, I would add as well that I think a reason that Holocaust education matters is simply that the Holocaust tells us something about what it means to be human, right? It tells us something about the limits of human capability and culpability. It tells us something about responsibility. It tells us something fundamental about who we are. And, you know, I also love the point about the final stage of genocide being denial. It reminded me that we're still finding out so much about the Holocaust right now. You know, there were all those photographs of Sobibor that were discovered just in 2020, which, you know, makes you realize that we're still just in the stage where we're gathering evidence. So yeah, just still so much to learn.
Yeah, I think this is the most challenging question we all have. So how do we make it relevant? How do we make it relevant at this stage? So this is questions we, of course, coming from Israel, it's very, very present. It's present in politics, it's present in families, it's present in history, but also there we are seeing in the generation, it's becoming ancient history. So where does history become ancient history? This is always a thin challenge when we see a certain event. For me, the 1973, the Yom Kippur War in Israel seems ancient history, something we read about in books. I see faces here in the audience. I know my parents. For them, it seems like it was yesterday. So when it's something that is inevitable because every generation, depending on the age, sees certain events as really prehistorical events. And how do we make sure that this event, which was really, really a unique event in history, it was a genocide, that's true, but it was a unique genocide. And this is the point that we are emphasizing in Holocaust memory on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have to make it also a universal message. What do we learn from it for future generations? So we can't keep it only a particular unique event in history, but how do we make it also something that we'll learn for the future in order to always never forget on the one hand, and make sure it will never happen again to the Jews and to any other people in the world. And this message between collective memory and between the particular message, the humanistic universal message, is very contested, but it's very, very important if we want to keep it relevant. Keeping on the testimonies is great because this makes it alive, but after your generation, Brooke, it will need to be a fourth generation and fifth, and therefore I think it has to be a combination between the messaging and the storytelling. And the messaging needs to be a messaging that it's relevant for every person who sits there. If it's someone learning coming from Lawndale, Chicago, someone coming from Northbrook, or someone coming from North Carolina, it doesn't matter, or Israel, the message needs to be the same. What Luke said is correct, is what it made us as the human beings, how people became monsters, how the regular person became a monster, and how trying to make genocide for a particular group is something we can never allow again in history. And we need, on the particular level, we need Israel to be strong. On the universal level, we need to all fight for human dignity and human rights.
Okay, thank you all for your answers. Question number 2, we're going to start off now with Luke. So talking about, U.S. Holocaust education in the U.S. So some organizations and some individuals are concerned about the Holocaust education the way it exists now. Is there a reason to be concerned? Is that really the case? Should schools and teachers and wider communities share our concerns? Is Holocaust education failing in the US? And if so, why?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I certainly think that Holocaust education in the country is broken. I think that it's also very uneven across the country. If you go to some states and some schools where Holocaust education is mandated, you'll see that the schools have terrific Holocaust education programs already in place, right? They will have guest talks with survivors, they'll do field trips to their local museums, they'll have connections with local Jewish organizations, and the students are really getting a kind of a good diet of Holocaust education. Then you go to other parts of the country and it's not taught, period. It's not part of the curriculum, it's not mandated at all. It's perfectly possible to go through K through 12 without ever being taught about the Holocaust in the classroom. So definitely uneven. And I think broken also. The reason being that so many teachers, and I should add immediately, through no fault of their own, right, that there are very few guidelines on how to teach this impossibly difficult subject. And teaching is an incredibly difficult job anyway. And I think because of that, teachers are so prone to falling back on pop culture. They'll teach through The Boy in the Striped Pajamas or Number the Stars, these works that deliberately blend fact with fiction in order to kind of tug the heartstrings. And that's not a way to learn about anything. So yeah, I think the educational community should be concerned. And if failing is too strong a word, then I think Holocaust education is definitely falling short right now. And I'll be happy to pass over to either Daniel or Brooke for thoughts on that too.
Brooke, go ahead.
I think uneven is the perfect word to describe it. The state of Illinois is the first state to mandate Holocaust education, and they did so in 1990. So I actually was a beneficiary of that. This was something I did learn about in school, and there was thorough programming around it and ways to engage. That's not universal. That's not everybody's experience. So we do see, like, from my view as a 3GNY speaker, I'm engaging with teachers who really plan incredible lessons about the Holocaust, who have really diverse lesson plans, students who ask amazing questions. So I see like the highlights of what could be, but it is very uneven. Not every school is doing that. There are some schools that only cover the Holocaust in a day, so they're not really able to give it ample time to really discuss what happened and spend thought on it. So it's very uneven, and I think bringing more mandates and kind of uniform between how we approach the Holocaust, making sure everyone does get a chance to learn about it, would help a lot in evening out a lot of those gaps.
I will just say very briefly, because I'm not well enough aware of what is happening in the education system here, and I would want to criticize it. I will say that here, the challenge in education of the Holocaust, I think it's a universal challenge all over the world, is how do we make it? We can mandate it, but it needs to still be something that people want to do. A lot of times when things are mandated, people tend to, it's like what happened to me in mathematics. So the more you have to learn something, the more sometimes people tend to ignore it and say, what do they want from me now? And I think it's certain ways, if done properly, when it's done in a different manner, yes, to mandate it, but then to make people who are interested to expand and elaborate it. I think it's better that a few know a lot and then can be active about it than a lot know very little about. So I think they need to find a combination, maybe differentiate between schools, differentiate between capacities of schools. Not every school has the same capacity to teach it. The resources are different. The quality of teaching is different. And I think it also needs to be adapted accordingly to the level.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to offer one quick final thought, which is that you're absolutely right. That, you know, Daniel said that mandating is not enough, and Brooke pointed out rightly that in some states where the Holocaust is mandated, that means that you have one day, one lesson, one day, and that's it. And I think it's kind of useful as a thought experiment to compare this with math, right? Imagine you're a math teacher and somebody says to you, I want you to teach the quantum theory of mechanics. And by the way, you only have one lesson to do it. That is the historical equivalent of telling a teacher that they have to do the Holocaust in one day, right? The hardest topic you can do and one day. That's a shortcoming for sure.
Okay, Daniel, this question is going to be for you, and you already started, I think, to start to get at this. So, you know, students begin to encounter the Holocaust as early as middle school, yet the content can be upsetting, it can be distressing, even for adults. So how are teachers, parents, community leaders meant to navigate this disparity between age and content? And is it reasonable to expect teenage students to study the Holocaust?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And in Israel, we start even from certain years in kindergarten. So it's from a different approach, different narratives, of course, and it's adapted to the age. But there are different sensitivities, you're correct, between if it's kindergarten, if it's elementary school, if it's middle school, if it's high school. What is the right? I'm not expecting here to implement it in the kindergarten. In Israel, it's a different thing because it really is also part of our collective history, in our personal collective history. And therefore it's from a younger age, it's part of the general national narrative also. But it needs to be done in a very, very intelligent manner. So I think I actually visited the Holocaust, the Illinois Holocaust Museum recently, and I was very impressed on the technological elements there of the virtual tour. So the virtual reality, from what I saw, is a way to bring people who today, we need to remember, we are living in a world today that we are zooming now, it's true, but this is not the highlight of technology. People today don't sit and watch an hour and a half film. It's too long for them. People don't read articles that are longer than a few words. It says in the beginning of your article how many minutes it will take you to read, 1 or 2. If it's more than 2, people stop reading it. So we need to remember, we need to make, this is true for everything in education, in the school system, regardless of the Holocaust. We need to adapt it to the changing reality. And we need to remember it needs to come with things that are talking and engaging with the youth, whether it's films, as you mentioned before, whether it's virtual reality, whether it's a journey somewhere physically, whether it's making it alive through conversations about dealing with the topics that are relevant for them today and seeing what's the propaganda led to. Or as Luke said, his PhD was about classical music. So I would talk, if I'm going somewhere, how can rap music be connected to social change? And how can we avoid certain things from happening through music? You can play with it through the different narratives and different age groups, but it's very complicated. I don't think anyone has the model. And I'll just end by saying, I also saw Alison, I don't know if she's still here, she's from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, but they had a different model of engaging with the bus, a bus that goes to different places to talk about anti-Semitism and racial hate crimes. So engaging, coming to people instead of waiting for them to come to you. I think there are a lot of ways, but it needs to be, I think Luke is a bigger expert than I for educational matters. So pass it to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, I think for me, the answer to the question all boils down to the nature of the content. And I'd be interested to hear Brooke's perspective on this also. I will tell an anecdote, which is that I have a young relative back in the UK who's about 12 or 13, and they studied the Holocaust in school recently. And for her, that meant watching the movie version of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and she found it absolutely devastating, which didn't surprise me because that movie is meant to be absolutely devastating, right? It served its purpose very well. I don't think it taught her anything about the Holocaust, though. So my answer to the question would be, it depends on the nature of the content, right? If it's content that doesn't deliberately set out to traumatize you, then yeah, I think teenagers can engage with it if it's being done in an analytical, sober, academic kind of way. I think that the material can be really engaging for them. Certainly from my experience, it's something that they find fascinating. And yeah, with the right approach, I don't think that this disparity between age and content is such a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, it can be taught to teenagers. Can teaching the Holocaust be traumatizing? The answer is yes, if taught inappropriately. There have been stories that have come out of teachers having role-playing type assignments and lesson plans. That is traumatizing. It is disrespectful. So it's not to say that Holocaust education cannot have that negative side effect, but when done correctly, it's not traumatizing. It's actually taking a really difficult subject matter and talking about it openly and teaching about it so students know that they can handle difficult things. I think sometimes when we think about the material being traumatizing for students, we forget that students go through their own traumas. They're not necessarily having no traumas already when they step into the classroom. So to be able to talk about something very difficult like the Holocaust, I think is actually a really great gift to give them the tools to be able to think about it, engage with it, and talk about it on an intellectual level.
Okay, and that leads us to our next question. And Brooke, I'll ask you to take the lead here. So interest in the Holocaust is high as ever. If you look at all the books, the TV shows, the movies about the Holocaust that are coming out, and yet recent studies and surveys show that knowledge and meaningful remembrance of the Holocaust are declining. So how can this be? Does it point to failings in the way the Holocaust is taught? So how do you explain this gap between sort of this public interest and then public knowledge of the Holocaust?
So from my perspective, public interest is really looking at all of those media touchpoints, the books, the TVs, programs, films, documentaries, and those are often speaking to adult audiences. But surveys on public knowledge often are talking to young people and what's the next generation know. And I really don't think they have had as many touch points as older generations have had to engage with the Holocaust. So just because a lot of movies exist and are out there doesn't mean that they've seen them. So it becomes, what content have they seen? What do they have access to? Is it enough? Is it accurate? So I think the interest might be there, but actually creating those touch points so there is kind of a safe way for them to engage with it, done in a supportive manner, well-researched, all of that, then starts to build the bridge to knowledge. But just because older generations know, we really can't assume it's innately passed down or that people have been able to interact with those materials. I think there's curiosity there, but there isn't always a clearer entry point.
I agree, and I want to reiterate what I said before about the prehistory and ancient history and history. So if we think about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, those who studied and were interested and knew about it were or first generation or second generation, if they were part of the Holocaust, if they were survivors, or if they were American soldiers who knew people there in the war, or Europeans who were, some of them were the victims of Nazism, some of them were from the other side. It was just dealt. So there were people, generations who built Europe after the war. There were American soldiers, Russian soldiers. I mean, things were alive. It was part of what they grew up in. It was part of their narrative history. It was something that you could read in the news. The Eichmann trial in Israel was something that you read in the news. It was the most talked about thing. And we see interest. Interest is correct. We see new movies coming out. We see articles. We see research. We saw now Anna Frank's story suddenly with the FBI. it makes it more, I would say, appealing, because FBI, cool, mystery, and we see these things, it becomes something which is more in common culture. Again, like we see the gladiators, old Rome, Athens, we all know a little bit about it from computer games. We know a little about it from films. These were history, periods in history, and the Holocaust is becoming, it's inevitable, it's becoming another piece of history. We can't fight that. What we can do is try and make it all the time relevant and keep the flames low and keep it relevant to our discussions today. So if we see a synagogue attacked in Texas, we need to remind people that this is what happens when racism begins. Doesn't matter if it's Islamic terrorism, right wing, left wing. What racism brings to, it brings to human casualties. And we need to fight it wherever it is. And we need to always bring the flag up to make it relevant. And then how do they learn more about it? We need to always trigger their curiosity to read more, to discuss more, to ask more. But it will always become history.
Yeah, that's a great point. For me, the gap between public knowledge and apparent public interest is something that's just completely fascinating. And I think there's no quick and easy explanation for why it exists. But certainly all of the signs are that it does exist, right? That we have surveys being published by groups like the Claims Conference. And I like Brooke's term, media touch points, that, a lot of those are obviously not directed to a youth audience. But even for ones that are, they're just not useful sources of information a lot of the time is the bottom line. And I think also it just seems to be a universal truth that pop culture recycles stuff that sells, right? And that's not exclusive to the Holocaust by any means. If you look at the Disney Channel and just look at all of the stuff from the 90s that they're rebooting, the reason they do that is because they're recycling something they know that's going to sell. So with Anne Frank, for example, I know of at least 22 separate movies, all telling the Anne Frank story in roughly the same way, right? Because it's this kind of constant recycling. And if you combine that with the lack of Holocaust education across the country, the lack of mandates, the unevenness that we spoke about earlier, it creates this kind of terrible vacuum that's filled by pop culture, right? So if somebody is interested in it and they're not being taught about it in the classroom, then where do they go? They go to movies, they go to novels. And so on the one hand, you see this kind of interest rising, but at the same time, there's no evidence of knowledge growing.
22 adaptations of Anne Frank. All right. I will admit that I have seen a handful of those myself. So yeah, let's talk about all the material that's out there. So there is a lot of material out there relating to Holocaust and how, potentially teachers can use different information to teach the Holocaust in their classrooms. So how can individuals and organizations that promote Holocaust education, like the Ninth Candle, for example, better support schools, teachers, and students? And Luke, I'll start with you and then we can go from there.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think for us, the first and most important thing is that we're treating schools as partners, right? So we start off with a basic acknowledgement that teaching is a very difficult job and that teachers are in a very difficult position every day, no matter what's going on, but especially if they're being asked to teach something as difficult as the Holocaust. And then we also, embrace what I regard as a kind of universal truth, which is that there is no one way to teach the Holocaust. The way in which it's done is going to vary by necessity from one community to another, from one state to another, from one school to another. And that means that the approach always needs to be tailored. And you can only achieve that tailoring by opening a dialogue with the school. So listening to the teachers, listening to what they're trying to achieve, listening to what their goals are and what they've done so far, and listening about their kids that they have in their classroom. Each cohort is different from the next. And then you partner with them and you build up something that's specific to them. I think that definitely is a good way to begin. And, for for us also, like I said, just very important not to fall back on the pop culture materials and begin with the basic facts, right? We never take for granted that a student knows what anti-Semitism is. We never take for granted that they know what Nazi Germany was. We never take for granted that they know what the Holocaust was or how or why it happened. And another kind of final thing that I'll say before opening it up a bit is that one thing that we're very keen on is the use of language. So we deliberately don't use words like combat or tackle. We're not out to combat or tackle or fight anyone. Our mission is specifically to end anti-Semitism by sharing knowledge. I've found that if you go to states where Holocaust education isn't mandated, if you go to states and or schools in states that have serious, crucible political issues that are extremely heated, it puts them on the back foot if you knock on the door and say, hey, we're here to fight, we're here to combat, we're here to tackle. So that's kind of a new thing that we've introduced, and I think it's for the good.
I'm all for less violent language, definitely. It does not make sense metaphorically. So from a 3G perspective, we see our role in the classroom as kind of supporting, partnering with teachers, complementing their lessons. So they have some understanding of a history before we come in the classroom. And what we offer is storytelling. So we're telling personal stories and really giving a meaningful connection. We couldn't possibly tell the whole story of the Holocaust, but we're telling one survivor's story. And of course, it's a survivor who means a lot to each of us personally, since our grandparent. And it builds empathy within the students to really understand what somebody went through. Every journey is completely different, but be able to have that one-on-one kind of storytelling in addition to all of the lessons and the history helps give weight to those lessons. So offering these different ways to engage, whether it's books, documentaries, lesson plans, storytelling from a survivor or a descendant of survivor, I think it's this kind of multi-tactic approach that helps the lesson land more.
I agree, and I think that the more using all methods, so if it's testimonials, if it's discussions, bringing to the personal elements makes it work. And talking about films and how they're succeeded in building it. So if we even think about Schindler's List, which is one of the first ones from the Hollywood new films about the Holocaust. When people are talking about the Holocaust today in Israel or abroad, one of the first things they'll think about is Schindler. So whatever he did or didn't do. So he's the thought of the Holocaust, their story, seeing the Holocaust survivors in the end go to Jerusalem and put a stone on his tombstone. And then think about the story, which a lot of elements sees a problematic story. So as Schindler himself, it's not a clear-cut story what his role was or not. So there are stories to both directions, but in general, people know that. And the narratives that are built through these films, I think, are the most effective way. And I think testimonials are another effective way when people hear, but the less it comes from firsthand. But actually, I think the idea of a 3G, what you're doing, Brooke, is wonderful, because it brings you, they're seeing you and you are portraying your grandparents' story. It's also great. But again, if we want it to last, it needs to come in methods and methodologies that are people like to see, watch, visualize, and feel. And I think films are one of the best elements to do it.
Yeah,
I see Cindy saying yes. There's Cindy's turn.
That's definitely true, and certainly, to give examples of the kind of thing that the Ninth Candle does. I mean, we're very keen on casting a spotlight on untold stories in history, and especially those that involve Jewish resistance on the one hand and Nazi disorganization on the other. That's part and parcel of our mission to counter myths about the Holocaust in pop culture. So one presentation that we've been asked to do several times is about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. So we'll talk about figures like Alexander Pechersky, the man who led the uprising in Sobibor, and taking that event and using it as a lens through which to see the whole of the Holocaust is something that really helps the students see the entire thing in a new light. I think it humanizes the story for them, because the way that it's usually told, where Jewish victims are very two-dimensional, it kind of goes against that, and it helps turn them into people that they can relate to more easily. And then, of course, another thing that we'll do is take examples of the Nazi propaganda machine and get them to analyze these things, the posters, the radio shows, the movies, and very careful guided analysis to help them understand how was hate normalized, how was it trivialized in some circumstances, and then how does that open a door for radical consequences in the future.
Okay. Daniel, I'm going to ask you to take a start at this question, and it is an open-ended question here. And for folks who are listening, feel free to continue submitting your questions. We are going to move to that section next. But Daniel, beyond simply improving Holocaust education, what specific goals are we aiming towards? Where would you like to see U.S. Holocaust education in 2030?
So I think the goals of Holocaust education today, not only in the US, but everywhere in the world, are we talked about it before, but I think it needs to be very clear. So to remember what this is what Luke said in the beginning, it's correct, what the human race can do, in what levels it can, a person, Hannah Arendt talked about it in her writings, but what is a person, an average person? These people were not born monsters. They were professors, they were doctors, they were the elites. They were not the thugs you think about. They were also the thugs, but they're not the average person you think is this racist, the extreme guy, the people with the bald people walking on the streets. It's not them. The ones who led the Wannsee conference. Now we are talking about the Wannsee conference, which took place a few days ago. Who sat there? These were the highest level bureaucrats. And the people who were all, I think most of them were doctors. So Luke is a doctor, I'm a doctor. I mean, there are other doctors here around us. These are people who could be the distinguished colleagues. They were people in the highest levels, and they sat there very technically, described how they are going to erase the human race, city by city, country after country, coming with statistics, just a normal page here, saying how many Jews are in each country, how many people do they need to each country, and that's it. They just did it over a beautiful looking setting on the Wannsee Lake in Berlin. And this is the most important reminder. These were normal people doing horrific things. And this needs to be our flag, that it can happen to every person in the world. And it's our responsibility as human beings, as Americans, as Israelis, as Jews, Christian, Muslims, it doesn't matter who, Buddhists, to combat it, to stop it when it's young, to cut it when it's young, and not to say it's going to be fine, let's ignore it. So this is just a bad word saying about a Jew. This is just a bad word about someone else. No, it's bad enough when it's said in the beginning. And if you don't stop it in the beginning, it's a very, very dangerous path. Doesn't mean that it's going to be again. People sometimes tend to think it's going to be. So if it's not the Germans doing it against the Jews, in this circumstance, it's not the Holocaust. But there are certain things and directions that we need to be aware of, that they are very, very dangerous. And this is the aim, the goal of this education.
I think that's such an important point, Daniel. I'm glad that you mentioned the Wannsee conference, because the lesson of that is that intelligence and racism are not mutually exclusive qualities, right? People can be both, and the Wannsee conference is just such an alarming example of that, because like you say, everyone there is a doctor, they've all got their PhDs, a lot of them are lawyers, and yet they're planning this terrible event. So for me, Holocaust education by 2030 in the US, one very specific goal I would like to see is a mandate for Holocaust education to be taught in every state, right? Because at the moment, it's something like 32 or 33 states that don't have any mandate for the Holocaust to be taught at all, which means the majority of states. And that's something that we can work toward, I think, in the next 7 or 8 years, is making sure that happens. And then I think, to build on something Daniel was saying earlier, then we need to start the work on transforming Holocaust education and how it's done, right? That it needs to be presented in such a way that the next generation is going to connect with it to ensure that come the year 2100, let alone 2030, that this topic is still going to be taught in schools.
I personally cannot think as far out as 2100, but for 2030, what I'd like to see is more thoughtful engagement. I think a lot of times in the teaching of the Holocaust, it gets really flattened, and it's a really simple good versus evil type story, and there's no color to it. But in fact, there are so many shades and so many stories. Not all survivors were in camps. Not all survivors had the same experience. So bringing a wider range of these stories, bringing a wider view of history, and even like different entry points. Just thinking about music, for example, there's so much relating to music and the Holocaust to think about. And that's just one very specific way to consider teaching the Holocaust, learning about it. So I'd love to see a little bit more complexity and complication, so that there's something for students to grab onto, because some students, some things are really going to stick with them, and for others, they're just not going to be as interested. So having a wider range of colors, bringing it to life in a more complex way, that's something I would love to see long-term with Holocaust education.
Great. Well, thank you for answering the question about where we'd like to see Holocaust education long-term. I am going to start reading some questions from the audience. So please continue to submit those in the chat box. A lot of questions about if you're in a state that doesn't have mandated Holocaust education, how do you begin? How do you teach it? What would the panelists suggest that you do to, as a step one to teaching Holocaust education?
I can take a stab at this one.
Sure.
There are so many organizations with incredible resources, curriculum and lesson plans. Echoes and Reflections comes to mind, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So if you're a teacher without any sort of curriculum and you're trying to get started, I would really recommend looking into those resources, even reaching out to an organization like 3GNY. We can help connect you with some of that, as well as supporting you with a speaker for your class. So tapping into what all these organizations have been doing is a great way just to get started.
Yeah, and Brooke, I was going to say the exact same thing, that my first recommendation would be to unearth organizations like ours and to get in touch with them and to strike up a partnership. And I think you mentioned Echoes and Reflections. There's also Facing History in Ourselves, the Institute for Curriculum Services, just so many. And you know what, the best thing about it is that they're all offering something different. That they're all offering, like you said a moment ago, Brooke, their own kind of individual color and different ways for bringing this to life. So it doesn't have to be exclusive. You can partner with more than one organization. And I think that reaching out and striking up that partnership is a great first step. And then you go from there. And just get all the help that is freely available, and just avoid falling back on what's been done in the past.
Those are they are the experts. Go to the next one.
Okay, great. Another question that just came in. So the question says, you mentioned the importance of highlighting specific anecdotes, specific stories to help tell the true story of the Holocaust. How do we ensure that the stories we tell don't reinforce stereotypes of Jews? And they have an example here. For example, Israel relied on sharing stories of Holocaust heroes for many years, but in the process created the perception that the other Jewish victims of the Holocaust were passive victims who deserve their fate.
It's a very good question. And I think that when we're looking into that, we also see different films coming from different times and different generations. So We see also, for instance, my wife wrote her master's about the good German figure in German films after World War II. I've never heard of that. But the films that were produced in Germany, in the America-occupied Germany then, and the films were done in order to do propaganda against the Soviets. So they showed the Germans as those resisting, they showed the German resisting the Nazis. That was the emphasis in the German films in the 50s, which was completely the minority of the minority. But they tried to rebuild the society through these films. So we see similar things we see when we are trying the Jews. So in the beginning, when the state of Israel was founded, for instance, Holocaust was not talked. It was a silent thing. It was against what Israel tried to build, the strong new Jew who is erasing the past, is strong. The Holocaust survivors were put aside. The next generation started to talk about it. Then we started to see, after the Eichmann trial, things popping up, the beginning of the Holocaust discussions. But still, yes, the stereotype, the more stereotypical, very weak Jews there. And with the time, you see more and more righteous among the nation stories on the one hand, and you see resistance stories on the other hand. So if it's the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or other places or other stories, and now we see films of second generations going back to their ancestors' place to figure out the stories. So some of them are fiction, some of them are documentary, some of them are combinations. So it's evolving, and I don't think anymore it's a stereotypical, it's a complex picture which one sees. And of course, yeah, we always need to be aware of the stereotypes. We don't want them to be foreign, but if we know how to find the right films and the right stories told, there are a lot of everything, and the mixture is great. So we really can find, there are a lot of resources available. If we know how to find and build the curriculum right, I don't think we'll get to that.
Yeah, to build on that, because earlier I mentioned Alexander Pechersky, the man who led the Sobibor uprising, as someone that the Ninth Candle presents on a lot. And for me, the answer to that question is pretty simple. And it's that story must be framed in a bigger picture. So you're not telling it in isolation. You're using it as a kind of entry point into the subject. So that means telling the students something about what Sobibor was and why it existed in the first place. So that means telling them what came before it, and then why the Nazis decided it was necessary to build a place like this. It means looking at the uprising and figuring out how it works. It also means looking at how the Nazis responded to it, and then how they changed their approach in the future. So when we do that presentation, we're not setting out to lionize Alexander Pechersky. We're setting out instead, I'm going to come back to that term that Brooke used again, to bring more color to the Holocaust, just to tell a story that's kind of going against the grain of all of the stuff that they encounter in pop culture. And I think by avoiding talking about the story in isolation, what we're doing is giving them a route into the Holocaust that perhaps tells it in a way that they are unfamiliar with.
Yeah, I would also add that this question is a great kind of demonstrator that conversation is an incredibly important part of teaching the Holocaust, being able to engage and talk about it, ask questions. I gave a presentation about my grandma's story to a class, and one of the questions I got from a student was, what did she attribute her survival to? Was it her bravery and confidence? Which shocked me, because no, absolutely not. It was not, if you're confident, you'll survive. That's by no means my takeaway, but it's a good question to ask, to poke into it, because they're clearly looking for those connections. And we talked about all the luck that's involved in surviving, and that of course there's bravery on top of that, and of course there's confidence sometimes, and doubt sometimes, and fear sometimes, and maybe small moments of happiness in there too. It's incredibly complex. So by giving students kind of room to ask questions, and even those questions might suggest they might have missed something, I think it's incredibly important, because it's a way to bring back these ideas of adding color and making sure they're understanding this larger picture.
Okay, another question that is coming in is, and this is, I think, geared more towards, well, I think all the panelists can maybe speak to this, but what have For those that work with educators, with teachers, what specific resources have you seen teachers use that have gone well? Are there specific textbooks? I know we talked about some books that maybe are not great beyond pop culture references, but are there anything that you're seeing that teachers are doing well when you guys go into classrooms?
Well, I happy to go first with that. I think one book that I do always recommend and that I think goes down very well is Lisa Weimer's book, The Assignment. If you haven't seen The Assignment yet, I do strongly recommend it. It's about two students in present day America who are challenged by their teacher as part of their Holocaust education to defend the final solution, right? So they're having this class debate, this kind of activity of the sort that we were discussing earlier. And the two students decide that they are going to stand up to their teacher and say, actually, no, we don't want to do this. The reason that I like the book is because on the one hand, it's teaching students kind of broad brush lessons about what it means to be an upstander and an ally and to stand alongside people in your community. The other reason that I like it is that the author is very good at getting factual information about the Holocaust across, because they obviously have to learn this stuff as part of the debate. So that's a book that I think kids find really engaging, and I think I've seen a lot of teachers use that with success.
So when I present to classrooms, I often seek out schools that are teaching the book Night by Elie Wiesel, simply because he comes from the same hometown as my grandma, so we're able to make connections between the book. It sort of deepens her story when I present. But I would say any book that is really grounding the experiences of survivors and victims is a great entry point. We do see a lot of these stories that are about the good German, or, you know, these kind of like exception stories, but really finding a survivor story, which is one of many, I think is probably a better place to start, in humanizing the victims, of course, and also giving a more realistic picture of what people were experiencing.
Another question's coming in about how to get started. So I know, Brooke, you mentioned earlier, and Luke, you mentioned different organizations that have curriculum, that have lesson plans. You know, some of those websites can be very overwhelming. How do you suggest a teacher goes about getting started? Should they sort of reach out to you first? And what would you recommend the courses? As again, a lot of those websites just have sort of general templates to download and perhaps are not as helpful as they could be.
Well, I would certainly say that, yeah, I get it and I agree. I think that for Holocaust education in general, the organizations, we need to get away from just generating more content and more towards these kind of partnerships and tailored programs. So yeah, I would say as a first step, just reach out, just email the generic address. For us, it's info@theninthcandle.com. And build up the partnership from there. Obviously I'm familiar with a lot of those free lesson plans that are out there. A lot of them are very, very good, but they overlook the brute fact that Holocaust education in this country is just so uneven that it really means that any kind of one size fits all lesson plan is, I don't want to say necessarily doomed to failure, but it's never going to be the same as having a tailored program that's built up in partnership with an organization like the Ninth Candle or 3GNY.
Thank you. I do want to go ahead and I have a request from Rachel Bornstein to go ahead and actually take herself off mute. So she should be able to unmute now. Just 1 second.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Rachel Borenstein. I'm the president of the Staten Island Holocaust Center. And Dr. Luke, we're looking forward to meeting you at the end of the month. We have a joint session, and hello to Brooke and Dr. Daniel. This is an interesting discussion, and I just wanted very briefly, don't want to take too much time, just to share with you this vision that I have for the future of how are we creating an effective communication with everybody about the Holocaust on multiple levels, how we are successfully distributing the vast amount of information that we have. How do we balance this peaking interest and the reality of decrease in knowledge? So in my head, I have a technology background. So in my head, I'm calling it the Wikipedia of the Shoah. An area on the cloud, and it's probably a development effort that will require many educators and many people that have their heart set in helping the education to kind of volunteer and support and add this information into that. Innovation and technology is out there. We have the internet, and we are able to those communication channels to get to everywhere in the world. So it's feasible technically to create on the cloud that type of mechanism. So in that vast storage of Wikipedia, we need to sort of form a consortium or a group of educators, of doctors, of knowledgeable people that will be able to organize it in such a way that it will be easy, for people that want to look into lessons for certain grade or certain categories of how to look into it. So it requires some thinking, it's requiring design, it's requiring collaboration of a lot of people. But in my head, the time is ripe to engage in such a vast project and get all the resources of all the people that have the heart in making sure that Shoah is something that we will never forget. And even though my not-for-profit organization is called the Holocaust Center, I think the word Shoah, the mass murder of the Jewish people, is so effective. And there is so many lessons to be learned from it for other people, not just the Jewish people, that I think that type of a project will be fruitful and will allow schools, people in states that may not have a mandate to have a Holocaust education, but if there is a intelligent and driven teacher that wants to do something, I'm finding the problem of how to get the communication and how to create a distribution so immense and so big that it's a showstopper for many productive situations. So I'm sorry to take so much time speaking about it, but I really wanted to share some of my thinking with this group, because I feel that everybody on this Zoom call thinks along the lines of how we can improve and what can we do to make it better. So thank you for allowing me to share this with you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. It sounds like a fascinating idea, and I've written down while you were speaking 2 words in giant capital letters. One is partnership, and I do think it's so important for organizations like ours, whether they're nonprofits or consulates or whatever else they may be. I think it's so important to acknowledge that we have a shared goal and to come together to work in our own ways toward the kind of shared realization of that shared goal. The other word that I wrote down is patience. I know the feeling of getting in touch with schools and emails not being responded to, or schools replying initially and then going off radar. It happens, and it happens because schools are very busy places, and like I said, teachers have super demanding jobs. And I think the best response for us is just empathy, to acknowledge that they do have a tough job, and also to remember that with enough persistence we'll get there. And I'll be happy to hand over to Daniel and Brooke to share their thoughts too.
So in Staten Island, the anti-Semitism is at its highest. I don't know if you follow the news about events and things that are happening here. We have a company called Tzim that's actually an Israeli-based shipping company. And the amount of anti-Semitism against them is just overwhelming. They have a headquarters or an office in Staten Island. So I'm working currently with the Staten Island schools. People are reaching out to me and saying, we would like to have Holocaust education. Give us something. And I'm not an educator, and I'm not in the position to ship things to them. That's why I'm partnering with you, Dr. Luke, and that's why I'm reaching out to many other entities in United States, like in Florida. The state of Florida has an education program that I reached out to them to get information so I can distribute. I've reached out to Washington State. They also have a Holocaust Center there that's creating trunks of education. But I think that's the problem, communication and distribution. People don't know where to go and to get what they need for the right, proper audience to do that. Many people, I think, are reaching out to me. I'm getting very good response, but myself, individually, not really able to solve it unless, you know, we have what you said, partnership. That's a very good word. I agree with you, and vision of how we want to solve it, and getting more resources to help make it happen, make it a reality.
I just
We
want
have
to be.
time to respond, or
Yes, Daniel, please go ahead and respond, but I will ask Luke and Brooke while Daniel's speaking to go ahead and place your contact information in the chat. A lot of folks are asking how to get in touch. And then Daniel, once you're done speaking, please go ahead and put your contact information, but go ahead, Daniel.
We'll do so. I'll just say very briefly, Rachel, so that you mentioned SEAM and other things. So we, as the consulate, we are facing issues that are a bit different. We are facing the very thin line that is very often, also here in the Midwest and other parts of the US, is passed between legitimate criticism of the state of Israel and actions of the government, undermining its existence, and clear anti-Semitism. And it's very often laundried in a way that people say, no, I'm not against Jews, God forbid, some of my best friends are Jews, but the state of Israel, because they're not. And we say it against Israeli companies, we see it against Israeli entities. Just today, there are demonstrations in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, and another place in front of the Israeli consulate, because in South Africa, there was a private company that was now bought by a Jewish family, wealthy Jewish family, in order to bring back the company to life because it went bankrupt. And they are striking now, the workers, so there are demonstrations in front of Israeli consulates around the world. So it completely doesn't make sense. It's just this combination of this anti-Semitism in a different method, different way. It's a lot of times laundering anti-Semitism when calling it Israel. So we all need to be very aware of this fact that people, we see it by politicians, we see it by leading people in social media and other places, that they say we are not anti-Semites, but they are anti-Semites. And again, there's a lot of ways to do legitimate criticism on certain things, and then the crossing the line. So we need to be aware when it's crossing the line and when it's legitimate. I'll put my contact details now also. Thank you.
Okay, yes, so I believe Luke and Brooke and now Daniel, they're putting their contact information. I know we're running a little bit over, so I want to go ahead and wrap up the event, and let me throw it to Brooke to say a final word.
Oh, what word should that be? I'm not sure, but Sarah, I do want to thank you for hosting. This was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate hearing everybody's voices and seeing all these incredible questions. I think this is the thing that gives me the most hope about Holocaust education, is how many people truly and deeply care about it. So it's really beautiful to see.
Okay. And on that note, we are going to end. So I do want to thank everyone for their time. Brooke, Luke, Daniel, thank you all so much. Thank you all for attending and joining us for this hour we had together. Thank you for being here virtually. It's important we have these discussions and continue to have these discussions. So thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.